Welcome to episode 54 of the ClassCast Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Tibbens. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about a situation I ran into recently and how it got me rethinking the ideas of educational policy and the degrees of freedom that we allow for classroom teachers, for building level administration, and even for students and parents themselves. So I'll start off with a quick story and then sort of elaborate on how this maybe relates to other people's experiences. As we all know, on January 6th, we had a terrible day in the United States as a wild group of protesters, rioters, insurgents, you pick your word, stormed the Capitol building. Now, this became what everybody sort of considered a teachable moment. And then there's a lot of activity on social media between teachers saying, if you talk about this, this is how we do it. If you don't talk about it, this is why you're wrong. If you do blah, 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 and everybody made this an issue of politics. What nobody stopped to consider was whether or not it was actually possible to make time in class to have that discussion. So what I'm really getting at here is that a good decision in regard to policy, as opposed to is it good for students? I think that if you're a teacher who can remain, thoughtful, open-minded, avoid any extreme biases and things like that, then it's healthy to have that conversation with your students to help them to express their own thoughts and feelings, to maybe set the record straight a little bit as to what they've heard from friends or family, as opposed to what had been confirmed by, government authorities or legitimate news sites, etc. It's also a good time to let students sort of ask questions and engage with one another. Now, how can you do that, though, given the timing of the event and all the other things that maybe were facing teachers at the moment? So for me personally, we were about a week and a half away from the end of the second marking period, from the end of the first semester of the school year. Now, that is not necessarily a big deal unless you consider that grades need to be finished. And as a result of grading policies and goals, it would make a lot of sense to finish a unit before the end of the quarter so that you can gauge a student's learning, right? Now, my school division has recently adopted a mastery-based grading system. I say mastery-based and not actually mastery grading because we're not doing it super consistently, but I'm going to get to that later. The point here is that students are only given grades that quote-unquote count, that are actually calculated into the grade book for their summative work, for the work they do to demonstrate learning at the end of a unit or the end of an activity. So the formative pieces, the practice pieces, the work they do to learn along the way is entered into the grade book, but is not actually counted. We also then have a policy that says students have to have a minimum of 5 major summative assessments in each marking period. They can have a series of minor summatives as well. And then, there's this whole math equation that goes into it, that's not that interesting. In light of distance learning and some of the other pressures, the school board dialed that number back from 5 to 4, and then I believe we're at 3 right now. But the point remains, there's a minimum number of grades that needed to be entered that gauge mastery, and those formative grades, those practice pieces along the way, could not count. Homework couldn't count, regular classwork couldn't count, etc. So you have a week and a half until the end of the marking period, and a major event in our culture and in our nation's history occurs. And so ideally, yes, we're going to take the time, we're going to have that discussion. However, that also occurred just after winter break, and just before winter break, we had some snow days, right? So we lose a couple of instructional days, and I said, there's no way I can take the time to have this discussion. Now, I want to, and I think it'd be important, and a couple of kids sort of asked, hey, are we going to talk about that? And I'd say, well, I'd like to. We'll do it if we have time at the end of class. When a major cultural event occurs, that you should just use it, especially in an English or a history class where you're already sort of discussion-based, you're focused on culture, you're focused on the workings of the world and the human experience. Of course you want to have that discussion. However, as a teacher, you're also, compelled to follow the school's policies and to meet the expectations that are laid out in your employee handbook and that are laid out in your contract. So I made the regrettable decision, I feel terrible about it, that we didn't end up having that discussion in that class. However, in other classes where I already had the requisite number of grades, or I was confident we could get them done, where student attendance had been a little bit better, we went ahead and had that talk. We talked for 30, 40 minutes and let students reference some of the things we've read recently in class, Resistance to Civil Government by Henry David Thoreau. We're getting started on Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. There are a lot of sort of texts and concepts we've been dealing with, ideas of justice and the coddling of the American mind and safetyism and what does it mean to really have an open, honest discussion, even with people you disagree with. And all of this informed those discussions. It was fantastic. But I couldn't do it in the other class because the policy wasn't going to allow for it. So that's kind of the mini story here is that I felt like I couldn't take advantage of the teachable moment because the policy that was laid out required that I get through a certain number of assignments, a certain number of pieces. And because I was trying to adapt to the students' needs and differentiate for them to create additional time where necessary, which is really the goal of mastery grading in the first place, I couldn't actually do what I wanted to do. So I want to think about this from the policy perspective. Mastery grading is this idea that you grade based on a student's ability to master content. It doesn't matter when they learn it. If a kid masters it on day one, great. They get a good grade, you move on. If a kid needs 3 weeks to do it, fine, they get the 3 weeks. They need the time to master the content. So you don't take points off for late work, right? If a student does the work and it's not good enough, you give them an opportunity to redo it. Now, in true mastery grading, most people would tell you there's essentially infinite redos. The student will just continue to work on that project, work on that paper, whatever that assessment piece is going to be. They get to continue doing it until they achieve the point of mastery. And, we can argue whether that's 100% or 90% or pick your number. But that doesn't align with any other policies that we have in place. And so I don't mean this critically of my particular school division. I think this is going on in a lot of places. I've talked to some friends in other parts of the country. And as we've seen changes in the policies regarding grading or perhaps regarding curriculum and pacing guides and things like that, one thing that a lot of teachers are noticing, and maybe not enough teachers, honestly, I don't think are talking about, and that's why I'm doing this today, is the inconsistency between those policy pieces. Okay? So, for example, if mastery grading says all that matters is how well the student learns it, not how many tries it takes, not how long it takes. If they need an extra week, you give it to them. Then why on earth do we keep a traditional schedule and planning and grading system that has marking periods? Does it matter if a kid masters it in September or October or November? Well, better get it before November because now we're on to a new marking period, right? Well, what about the redo piece? Well, they could keep redoing it. Well, sure, but I can't slow down the entire class to let that, one kid continue to redo that assignment. So what's really going to happen is that kid's going to keep working on that same piece, that same skill, that same concept, while the regular sort of class content continues on. People say, well, why don't you differentiate it? Well, how much can you differentiate across 25 or 30 different kids in the room? If every kid works at a different pace, and if I'm supposed to allow them the time they need, then that essentially means I have to write 25 to 30 different lesson plans, different unit plans, have all of that worked out. That sounds great, right? Well, why not? Just differentiate it for each kid. But that's entirely impractical because the teachers already don't have enough time to handle all the grading, all the planning, all the interacting with students, not to mention communications, thinking email, website updates, and things like that. So we have to be practical in saying, what are we asking our teachers to do? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have policies that are clearly aligned to our goals. Okay, so it's either, policy should align with a fundamental belief. It's a starting point. This is why we're doing school, or this is how we want school to go. And then the policy aligns with those early thoughts. Or the policy aligns with the outcome that we have in mind. Students will be able to do these specific things, or we will achieve certain measures on a test, or students will fill a certain role in the community, right? But we need to align our policies essentially to the beginning or the end points. My concern is that more and more educational policy, particularly at the local level, is having to do with the in-between. Okay, it's not where we're starting and why we're going to do this, and it's not the end goal, what are students supposed to do or learn in the outcome. We see more and more policy aligned with the in-between. Well, by nature, policy is restrictive. And so if you restrict teachers' options and opportunities to adapt and flex to their students' needs, then we can't achieve the other goals we want, okay? We say we want to differentiate between students, and that's a great idea. Okay, we should differentiate for the students and help them. But if we put all of this on a calendar that still requires grades due and students to be done a certain thing, say by, the beginning of November or the middle of January or, whatever your quarter's aligned to, that doesn't really make any sense. Marking periods are entirely artificial constructs that are there to, I don't know, they don't fulfill any clear purpose anymore. Now, you have a semester 1, semester 2, because sometimes you're going to change schedules. Where I work, we have a block schedule, and so, students will keep their core classes year long, but some of their electives will switch. If you're on a 4x4, block system where students are going to take, some classes in the fall semester and then start the spring semester, they're in all new classes. Well, geez, you definitely have to get it done by that point, right? What happens if a student isn't mastering things by the end of the semester or by the end of the class? Do we hold them back? Do they do it again? Is that the point at which we say, well, good enough, and we move you on anyway? I don't really, I mean, I'm sure people have answers to this. And if you're listening and you're the person with the answer, I'd love to hear it. But I don't understand how something like, say, mastery grading or that sort of differentiation to individual students' needs aligns with the calendar that we've been using for a century or more, right? That doesn't seem to add up. Now, what about the idea of curriculum and pacing guides? The curriculum's good. We should all have a set of goals, a set of skills and knowledge that we want to teach throughout a class. But why on earth do we need a pacing guide if we understand that students are going to need more or less time to do all of this? That doesn't make any sense. The pacing guide might be there as a nice goal, but if I'm being held to it, then that means I can't do that extra differentiation. It means I can give students extra time to work on an assignment, but I can't continue to do it in class because I've got to keep the class aligned to the pacing guide. So if we're really going to do all of this well, I think we need to be consistent. If you want to do true mastery grading, if you really want to differentiate to the needs of individual students, then a pacing guide is probably gone. It's out the window. Maybe we have it there as something to look at, as a starting point for new teachers. I never taught the class before. Let me look at the pacing guide. That's fine. But if a teacher is going to be assessed, if they're going to be evaluated on their ability to keep up with the pacing guide, if there's a standardized test at the end of their course, so by May, students have to know these things and achieve these goals, then the pacing guide, I guess, aligns to getting students ready for the test, right? That would make sense. However, mastery grading doesn't. And the idea that we have to have, say, X number of grades in the grade book for each marking period also doesn't, because now what we're doing is we're working in one set of rules that have very clearly defined timelines, very clearly defined regimented timelines that say all students are going to move along at these paces. Then we have these philosophies of differentiation and of mastery grading that say throw the timelines out the window, do what's best for the students, adapt to those students' needs, and help them learn as much as possible. Now, in a way, both of these make sense. I kind of lean in the direction of those newer philosophies of the mastery grading and the differentiation. But if we're not going to throw away the old rules, then we can't really live or work according to the new ones either. So what is a teacher to do? Are we supposed to contact an administrator every time we have to make a decision about how to proceed in class? That doesn't seem professional for the teacher, and it doesn't seem like a good use of the administrator's time. Are we going to empower the individual teacher to make decisions about what's best for his or her students, what's best in that classroom, and how we best achieve the goals of the class? That seems ideal. That also means that we have to trust teachers to be professionals. Now, we can talk about other systems as well. Now, I'm going to mention one here that I only know a little bit about. And so I'm warning up front that I may misrepresent pieces of this. And if I do, I apologize and would love for someone to maybe come on the show and talk about it and correct me where I'm wrong. But in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, sort of a way to create a class and units and sort of broad plans that align with some sort of curriculum and pacing guide where students are going to be learning these concepts in this order, but they're going to have immense variety to learn in different ways. Students will be able to watch videos, read, listen to a lecture, work with their hands. Students will have options for how they're going to demonstrate mastery of the concepts, whether it's a test, it's an essay, it's a presentation, it's a project, it's whatever those things may be. Now, again, this sounds fantastic. But that also sounds incredibly unrealistic when you ask a teacher who's already balancing all the needs of 25 students to say, we now need to recreate your curriculum or recreate your class plan to adapt to a system that essentially allows students to work on their own, to teach themselves. Now the teacher says, well, but in UDL, I still teach. I still, provide some direct instruction. There is still some teacher guided learning. And then the students are free to work at their own paces or in the modes that work best for them. Well, that's fine, but what if a student isn't keeping up with those little pieces of direct instruction or with those other sort of benchmarks in the unit? Now, is that student falling behind? Again, this is an entirely artificial construct. It's an entirely fake idea that a kid has to learn a certain thing by a certain day. That's why during a pandemic, the idea of learning loss is something serious we should consider, but we should also remember that, we had a pace in mind that was completely arbitrary to begin with. Why on earth does a kid need to graduate high school at 18? Right? If we're really serious about differentiating, there are plenty of kids who should be graduating high school at 14, 15, 16 years old. They don't need that extra year or two. They've already learned the core content. They have the skills in math and English. They can go read a history book. They're going to be fine. If we're really serious about mastery grading, about differentiating for students' needs, about understanding that people mature and learn at different rates, then why the push for on-time graduation? I wrote a blog post about this a couple years ago, and I'll link it in the show notes. Why is it so important that people graduate high school right around the age of 18 or 17 and a half or whatever it is? arbitrary. Again, makes no difference. If a kid needs an extra year, why don't we just let them stay an extra year? Oh, well, because they need to get out, they need to graduate. It affects our on-time graduation rates. Who cares? Is that what we're doing here? We're just trying to pump kids out at the age of 18 with a piece of paper and say, go figure the rest out? Or are we serious about them learning the content? And if we're serious about them learning the content, well, then maybe we keep kids for an extra year or two. I don't understand what the problem would be, unless, of course, your concern is how you write a budget, how you use space in a building, how you schedule the courses. I think if we look very carefully, most education policy that is affecting actual instruction today has more to do with what makes sense for a budget or what's easy to administrate. Why does everyone have to have the same number of grades in their gradebook? Well, because that way it's even across the board, which completely ignores the fact that there are stronger and weaker teachers, that even good teachers have different strengths and weaknesses within their classrooms. We have this idea that somehow we can policy our way, we can legislate our way into perfect education, and that is completely unreasonable. Think about every time in the last few years you've heard someone use the phrase industrial model of education, like it's a terrible thing, like it's outdated. We need to move away from this industrial model of education. When kids went to public schools because we had taken them out of the factories, we stopped child labor in the early 1900s. They all go to school, but they all sat in their desks in rows, right? There's bells and they move at the bell and they sit down and they learn and they do this, all because what was the point of it? Now everybody says it was so that they could get out of school and go get a good factory job, or if they get out of school and then go to college where they would learn the real skills that they needed for, say, those white collar jobs to be a lawyer, a doctor, something else. So everybody says, yeah, we need to get rid of the industrial model of education. And then we turn around and implement policies that say, here's your pacing guide. Everybody needs to know these things by this point in May or June. We implement a grading policy that says everybody needs to have the same number of formative and summative assessments, that everybody needs to do the same kind of work the whole way through. Well, I'll be honest, if the goal is not to, put kids on an assembly line and push them through, then I don't know that we're writing policy that really changes that assembly line. All we're doing is changing what they do while they're on the assembly line. Okay, when people say the industrial model of education, they tend to be talking about the work that students are doing. But let's look at school itself as that industry. School has become an assembly line where we take young kids, we sit them on the conveyor belt, and as they go through, different sets of hands, different teachers, principals, counselors, etc., are all working with them along the way. But each teacher only gets a certain amount of time. Okay, after you hit that 9-month school year, beep, the assembly line moves down and you're someone else's problem now. You're on to the next stage of this, whether you're ready or not. We do so much social promotion in this country that no kid is actually guaranteed to learn anything from one grade to the next. Look at how most standardized tests work in early grades. Kids who don't master things for their Common Core tests or their standards of learning tests or whatever you want to do, how many of those kids get held back because they didn't learn the stuff by the end of the year? That almost never occurs. We say, oh, you didn't learn it. Well, we're going to move you on, but we're going to give you some extra tutoring next year. You're going to get some remediation. We're going to get you caught up. No, you're not. The kid already wasn't keeping up with classes. Now you're going to put them in new classes and tell them during the little bit of free time they had in a day, they got to go back and do work from their old classes too. The kid who was not academically inclined or motivated, whatever it may be, to get it done in the normal time frame is now going to do a new class in the normal time frame, plus go back and do the old stuff. Get out of here. This is insane. So what do we do? What are we going to do? Okay, what do we do if we want to actually differentiate for our students? What do we do if we want to take advantage of teachable moments? Something occurs in the community and we want to take a day to discuss it, to let students work together and talk about it, to come up with a solution, to understand its causes. Do I have the freedom and flexibility in my curriculum and pacing guide? Do I have the flexibility in my own classroom to say that this is a valuable activity and we should do it? Well, in a lot of places, yes, and in some schools, absolutely not. Or in some schools, you have the flexibility to do it, but only so long as you can convince the other 3 or 4 teachers in your grade level to do the same thing too, because we all have to keep that same pace. We all have to give that same assessment. We all have to use the same tools along the way. Tell me how that is striking back at the industrial model of school. There is no flexibility for the teacher. And if there's no flexibility for the teacher, how much flexibility can there be for the student? If you want to get away from this industrial model, if you want to get away from these rigid timelines, if you actually want to treat students like individuals and give them the opportunities that they need, then we need to align policies to that. That doesn't mean that we decide that something like differentiation or universal design for learning is the most important thing, because the only reason we put that at the top or near the top of a list is because it makes it acceptable for principals and school counselors to schedule large groups of diverse kids. And in this case, I mean diverse in terms of their academic abilities, reading levels, pace of learning, all this kind of stuff. It makes it acceptable for them to schedule them all into one class. It's very easy to do that, right? And then to say, okay, well, it's up to the teacher to figure out how to handle it. When I first started teaching, there were 3 and 4 levels of English at each grade level. And now for 9th and 10th grade, we're down to 2. I have friends that teach in places where there is 1. In fact, that's become really common in middle school. A lot of middle schools have just 1 class, and they always call it honors, right? Everybody feels good. Oh, my kid's in honors English. Knowing full well, the teacher looks around and goes, well, these 10 kids aren't reading anywhere close to a middle school reading level. These 10 kids, they could already be in high school doing it, and these 10 kids are about where they're supposed to be. And they throw them all in the same classroom and say, oh, no, it's okay. It's best for them, so they interact with each other. They help each other learn. The teacher can differentiate this. I'm not saying the teacher can't differentiate this. I'm just saying that's a lot of extra work to do that additional planning, to prepare the additional materials, to understand that those kids are going to work at different paces throughout it. So now not only am I preparing different activities, different reading materials for each given day, I have to understand that some kids moved ahead and some kids fell behind, and I have to continue to plan for that. Again, people do this, and there are some really, really good teachers out there that pull this off and do a wonderful job. But I think if you talk to most teachers, and I don't even want to say most teachers mean the average teacher, take your sort of above average group. You know, they're among the better teachers in the building. They're doing a good job. Ask them how much they can differentiate across one class, and then how much they can do that over a period of time. When we all have the same end of marking period to hit, we all have the same mastery to achieve, we all have the same test at the end of the year. None of this aligns. None of this makes any sense. If we want to end the industrial model of school, then we need to start thinking of students as something more than just the sum of their parts as they come down an assembly line. We also need to stop thinking about teachers as those factory workers. When most people say the industrial model of education, they think of the students as being treated like factory workers. But I would tell you that I think it's very different. I think that the students are treated like the materials on the conveyor belt. And that conveyor belt is going to move on at a set time, whether they're ready or not. Whether that person, that teacher who's the factory worker now working alongside that assembly line belt, whether you have finished your job with that student or not, that student's moving on. And when they get to the next teacher, now that next teacher goes, well, geez, the kid isn't fully assembled. How am I supposed to do my job? What am I going to do here? Well, hey, tough luck. Now you gotta do double time. You got to do the extra work, etc. If we're serious about handling students as individuals, about teaching students as individuals, then we need to understand that all of these artificial constructs of a set number of grades by this point in the year, this point in the year, and this point in the year isn't supporting that. We need to understand that a marking period system where we have to achieve certain goals by, November and January and March and June, that doesn't make any sense either. We maybe need to free some things up. So here's a couple quick solutions. Make policy align to end goals or core beliefs. Stop legislating the details. Hire teachers who can figure it out in between and trust that they'll make good decisions. Well, you say, there's a teacher shortage. We're not attracting the best and the brightest. How can we do this? Money helps, but money isn't the only answer. How about a little bit of autonomy? How about recognizing that teachers are more like craftsmen, more like skilled workers, right? If you want to go buy your shelf, your cabinets and shelves and all this stuff from IKEA, cool, do it. You assemble it. It all works the same way. You get a standard product. If you want something really nice, something custom to fit exactly what you need to work with the wood you have, you get a master craftsman. What we need to attract are the masters to the classroom, not people who work well on an assembly line. And really, that's what teacher education has been doing for far too long. We try to identify the students, or the teacher students who can work on that assembly line, and then we try to empower them with ideas of differentiation, which is really, good for students, but also happens to be a tool for administrative issues. We tell them, well, you can handle 30 kids in the room, when really all you're doing is make it easier for someone else to make a budget. We tell these teachers, you can do it, and you're going to do it for mediocre pay. Well, anybody who is smart enough to actually solve those problems and work through these situations is also smart enough to know that they can go to another job where they get more respect, less stress, and probably more money. So How are you ever going to attract the quote unquote best and brightest to the classroom when you treat all teachers like they don't know what they're doing? When the policies are written to the details of you're going to do this thing this week, this thing the next week, this thing the following week. When you have a policy in place that says everyone in a grade level has to work together, plan together, use all the same texts or give all the same tests. Yeah, great. You've created consistency, but you've also made it so that any person could step into that teacher's role and do that job. You have degraded the quality of the instructor to a glorified substitute. So who wants that job? Maybe people who like kids, maybe people who, I don't like their summers off. Those are fine, but you're not attracting the people who are actually most capable of addressing the diversity in the classroom, of helping students with their different needs. We haven't even gotten to the pieces of culturally responsive education, which is going to create even more complexity in this situation. Okay, so I'll stop here because I could rant about this for another hour, and I'm probably not going to say anything that's particularly new. But in terms of those solutions, the policy really needs to focus on the core values or the desired end result. Stop legislating the in-between. Let teachers function as master craftsmen who can make decisions to work with the materials they have and the tools they have available to create the best product they can. Now, I know I'm still talking about students like a product, right? And that seems offensive, but isn't that situation better where someone's adapting to you and they have the freedom and flexibility to change the grades, to change the way they're going to read something, to change the text, the test, the assessment, any of these pieces, rather than to be hemmed in by what was decided by a school board or a state legislature, or maybe what was decided by a team, even within their own building. So that's the policy piece. We also then need to think about what are the end goals and make sure that everything aligns to it. How important is it that it's easy to schedule kids? How important is it that we maximize the number of kids in each classroom? How important is the budget in terms of the instructional decisions we have to make? Because right now, we act like the budget doesn't matter in terms of the quality of teaching that happens. We act like the policy decisions that are made at the state capitol don't affect the day-to-day business of a school, in a classroom. We say, well, that affects the grade, or that affects the classes the kid can take. They have a new requirement. The kid has to take at least one online class, or they have to take X number of math or English. Every one of those pieces affects how school works on a daily basis. It affects the number of kids in a room. It affects the kid's motivation to learn and to do that work. And then when you turn around and tell teachers to differentiate, to be flexible, to allow students to express their learning in different ways, to say, take advantage of those teachable moments, get out of here with that, okay? You either want the assembly line or you don't. And my problem right now is that a lot of people in policy positions say they're against the assembly line and then go to work every day to write new rules that only more tightly regulate the assembly line, its timing, and its functions. If we want to be serious about improving education in this country, then we need to start at the top. We need to start at the top and think about how those policy decisions affect the quality of instruction each day, how those policy decisions affect how many or how few people want to take the job of a teacher. Again, it's not just money. Autonomy, freedom, and flexibility are a big part of this. If we want to make all of this better, then we need to think hard about being consistent in our goals and in our policies and making sure that we don't see the massive inconsistencies that currently exist, because all that does is frustrate and confuse the teachers. It frustrates and alienates the students, and it makes for a community that looks at what's going on in their kids' school and saying, well, none of this aligns to the policy. Well, maybe the policy was the problem in the first place. We need to be more purposeful in thinking about how we get rid of that industrial model, and that starts at the top. This has been episode 54 of the ClassCast Podcast. I thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts, concerns, suggestions, I'd love to hear them. If I did a poor job talking about mastery grading, universal design for learning, or any of the other things I mentioned in here, I would love for someone with more knowledge to come on and have a talk and explain to me how it works and maybe why it works better than I just explained. You can find the ClassCast Podcast at www.classcastpodcast.com and on all major streaming services. Thank you very much. Have a great day.